Well, we continue this morning in our look at heroes in hard times. This is our last in this series, and I gotta say, I'm really gonna miss that sermon bumper video. It's a great way to start off a message. I want to read to us today out of the book of Judges, chapter 16, beginning in verse 4. This is a story about Samson. Sometime later, Samson fell in love with a woman in the valley of Sorek, whose name was Delilah. The rulers of the Philistines went to her and said, "See if you can lure him into showing you the secret of his great strength and how we can overpower him so that we may tie him up and subdue him. Each one of us will give you 1,100 shekels of silver." So Delilah said to Samson, "Tell me the secret of your great strength and how you can be tied up and subdued." Samson answered her, "If anyone ties me with 7 fresh cords that have not been dried, I'll become as weak as any other man." Then the rulers of the Philistines brought her 7 fresh cords that had not been dried. She tied him with them. With men hidden in the room, she called out to him, "Samson, the Philistines are upon you." But he snapped the cords as easily as a piece of string snaps when it comes too close to a flame. So the secret of his strength was not discovered. Then Delilah said to Samson, "You have made a fool of me. You lied to me. Come now, tell me how you can be tied." He said, "If anyone ties me securely with new ropes that have never been used, I'll become as weak as any other man." So Delilah took new ropes, tied him with them. Then with men hidden in the room, she called to him, "Samson, the Philistines are upon you." But he snapped the ropes off his arms as if they were threads. Delilah then said to Samson, "All this time you've been making a fool of me and lying to me. Tell me how you can be tied." He replied, "If you weave the 7 braids of my head into the fabric on the loom and tighten it with a pin, I'll become as weak as any other man." So while he was sleeping, Delilah took the 7 braids of his head, wove them into the fabric, and tightened it with the pin. Again she called to him, "Samson, the Philistines are upon you." He awoke from his sleep, pulled up the pin in the loom with the fabric. Then she said to him, "How can you say, 'I love you,' when you won't confide in me? This is the 3rd time you have made a fool of me and haven't told me the secret of your great strength." With such nagging, she prodded him day after day until he was sick to death of it. So he told her everything. "No razor has ever been used on my head," he said, "because I have been a Nazarite dedicated to God from my mother's womb. If my head were shaved, my strength would leave me. I would become as weak as any other man." When Delilah saw that he had told her the truth, everything, she sent word to the rulers of the Philistines, "Come back once more. He has told me everything." So the rulers of the Philistines returned with the silver in their hands. After putting him to sleep on her lap, she called for someone to shave off the 7 braids of his hair and so began to subdue him. And his strength left him. Then she called, "Samson, the Philistines are upon you." He awoke from his sleep and thought, "I'll go out as before and shake myself free." But he did not know that the Lord had left him. Then the Philistines seized him, gouged out his eyes, took him down to Gaza. Binding him with bronze shackles, they set him to grinding corn in the prison. But the hair on his head began to grow again after it had been shaved. This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. Well, if ever there was a character which the Old Testament tells us about in rather unvarnished language, it's this man who became the last of the great judges of Israel during that period between their conquest of Canaan and the kingships of Saul and then David. The Bible really has to tell it that way because when all is said and done, what the story of Samson and Delilah is about is simply betrayal. Delilah's betrayal of Samson, but also Samson's betrayal of God. It's a tale of trust and lust, of treachery and loyalty, of justice and of bad judgment, of false bravado and feckless betrayal. You can make a good country western song out of this tale, one of those somebody done somebody wrong songs. Something like, if you won't leave me, I'll find someone who will. This is a story about a man who fell in love with a woman, and a woman who plainly loved money far more than she loved her man. So how is it, we may wonder, that Israel's strongest warrior and one of its best, if plainly flawed, heroes and judges of all time found himself where he did when it came to Delilah, the woman whose betrayal was to prove to be fatal to him? Let me suggest, first of all, that at least a part of Samson's problem was that he let his personal passions get in the way of his passion for God. If you go back a little way in the book of Judges, back to the 13th chapter, you will find that this man, Samson, was one of those rare individuals whose destiny was divinely set out for him before he was even born. The child of a man named Manoah and his godly wife, Samson was given over to the Lord, in fact, from the very beginning of his life. Following the instructions of a heavenly messenger, he was raised as a Nazarite, which means as one separated, consecrated, netzer, to cut to the Lord of Israel. His parents took on his behalf the Nazarite vow, which we can read about over in actually Numbers 6. That vow meant that Samson was required to do three things. First, he had to abstain from all products of the vine. He wasn't supposed to drink. He wasn't supposed to find his joy in anything but God. Second, he was never to cut his hair, which made him stand out as someone who had been set apart. And third, he was not to defile himself by coming into contact with a dead body, either of a man or of a beast. In turn, God made Samson the strongest man in all of Israel, the strongest man of his day. For certainly Israel's enemies, the Philistines, were afraid of Samson, tried to get someone who could defeat him. God thus had made a covenant with Samson, and Samson had no trouble keeping the second of those stipulations. I suspect he might have even been a little proud of his Fabio like lots. Samson was probably a pretty good judge. He served in that role for 20 years. But as for the other two practices that a Nazarite was supposed to follow, not so much for Samson. We know, for instance, that he often came in contact with dead things, usually because he himself had killed them. The famous story of him tearing apart a lion with his bare hands and then taking honey from inside of its carcass tells us Samson was clearly not worried about keeping himself ceremonially clean and pure in the eyes of the temple. Likewise, chapter 14 suggests that Samson probably liked a good party as well. It's doubtful he kept that vow of abstinence from imbibing the products of the vine as his heritage had told him to do. But most of all, however, Samson was a man whose personal strength was matched only by his lack of good sense sometimes. Now, in contrast to how some have stereotyped him over the years, I don't think Samson was a brute. I don't think he was an arrogant jock. He's mentioned in Hebrews 11 in the roll call of those who live by faith, whose weaknesses were turned to strength by God. But when it came to women, Samson had a real penchant for picking out the wrong ones. Chapter 14 records, for instance, how long before he ever met Delilah, that Samson's first love was a Philistine woman in Timnah. That was a little village approximately 4 miles down the same ridge of his hometown of Zorah, just to the west of Jerusalem, on the border of Dan and Benjamin, close to that, Dan and Judah, close to the border of Israel and Philistia. Despite the fact that it ran against the traditions of his people, which prohibited intermarriage with a pagan partner, and it was against the express wishes of his parents, Samson not only ignored all of that, he insisted that his father make the arrangements for that marriage. That relationship turned into a disaster. It was never even consummated, but because before the wedding festivities had even finished, the Philistine woman of Timnah, whom Samson had chosen, had already given away one of his secrets to 30 of Samson's opponents. She'd already betrayed him. And she, in turn, ended up being given to the best man to marry instead. Then in the beginning of chapter 16, we can read how Samson went down to Gaza one day. You can see it down along the south side of the Mediterranean. It was a Philistine stronghold, even as today it's a Palestinian enclave. And when he saw a prostitute there, the Bible tells us Samson went in to spend the night with her. We don't read these stories in Vacation Bible School. Only the word got out, perhaps from the woman herself, that Israel's greatest warrior was in town. So all the people laid in wait for him all night at the city gates in order to try to kill him in the morning. Samson got away by leaving in the middle of the night instead, simply ripping off the doors of one of the other city gates, post bars and all, and carrying it on his shoulders all the way back to Hebron. But somehow you have to believe that visiting a prostitute and putting himself in that precarious position in the first place, not exactly what any true man of God should have been doing. But Samson didn't learn from that one either. For as we read here in verse 4, later on he fell in love once more, this time with a woman in the valley of Sorek, whose name was Delilah. There's a little question about what the name means, but it's close to a Hebrew word that means to weaken or impoverish. Don't you wish Samson had paid better attention in Hebrew school? This time, Samson truly did pay the price for picking such a poor companion. Delilah was a nag, prodding him day after day until he was tired to death. Literally, that verse reads, vexed his soul to death. But she was a traitor to his love as well. She railed at Samson for lying to her about what the secret of his great strength was. Never mind, she was lying to him every step of the way. She even let men hide in the room where she and Samson were. I like the way the older translations put it. They rather ironically refer to those guys as her liars in wait. And so eventually, because Samson could not control his own passions, he put himself in a place where he truly did become vulnerable. A bad decision, which was to cost him his life. So why didn't Samson recognize what he was doing was wrong? Why didn't the strongest man in Israel catch on when Delilah turned out to be not on his side, just as his first wife had betrayed him? Why didn't he just get up and go like Joseph did when Potiphar's wife was messing with him? I think it's because, as Warren Wiersbe once said, passion had so gripped him, sin had so anesthetized him, he was unable to act rationally. Not only did Samson put his own personal passions before his passion for the Lord, he likewise let his pride take precedence over his personal responsibilities. Samson was so confident in his own strength that he forgot that when God gives a person power, it's always for a purpose beyond themselves. Leon Morris has noted that there is no sadder verse in all the Old Testament than this sentence here in verse 20. When he awoke after Delilah had cut his hair, Samson did not even know that the Lord had left him. Long before that moment, Samson had already left the Lord. He had great strength indeed, but God gave him that strength in order to be the protector of Israel, not to be its principal playboy. And if God should give you or me some ability or some particular gift, or if he should favor you with a position of power or with leadership, we ought never to forget it's not about you. It's about God. It's about other people. The real role of a leader is never simply to amass personal power for themselves. It's to use that power, that position wisely for the benefit of those whom they have been called to lead. I wish some of our leaders understood that now, both in this nation and in this world and in the church. I think on this Memorial Day weekend, the story of an ancient Roman statesman and a general, Lucius Quintius Cincinnatus. Cincinnati, Ohio is named for him. Lived in 458 BC, not far from Rome. Had a little farm. He was so poor that he had to do all the work on the farm by himself with his own hands. But everybody trusted him. And when anybody was in trouble and didn't know what to do, their neighbors would say, "Go tell Cincinnatus. He'll help you." One day, 1,000 of the brutal Achaean mountain men managed to trap much of the Roman army in a mountain pass outside of the city. And when word got back to the white-haired fathers in town, they sent for Cincinnatus to come and lead them. It said he left his plow standing right where it was in the field, raised up a group of fighting men, and with great courage and skill, he managed to beat back the invading army and free the Roman army, which came home with banners flying and shouts of victory. The people were so grateful. Cincinnatus could clearly have made himself king if he'd wanted to. His word was law. No man dared lift a finger against him. But before the people could even thank him for what he had done, he quietly gave back the power to the white-haired Roman fathers. He went home to his little farm. He picked up his plow where he'd left it. He was the ruler of Rome for just 16 days. And why? Because he understood power is given for a purpose that goes far beyond massaging our own pride. Cincinnatus cared more about the people's real needs, their need for a true republic and not a dictatorship, even a benign one. He cared more about that than about his position or his status within that society. He kept his pride in check. He never let it take precedence over his responsibility. What a difference there might have been in Samson's life had he been able to do the same. Because he could not keep his passions under control, because he picked poor companions when he disregarded the directions of his faith, because he let his pride get the best of him, forgot all about his responsibility. Samson paid a dear price indeed in his life. Judges 16:21 vividly portrays what someone once called the blinding, binding, and grinding effects of sin. But then we should notice one final aspect about his life. which was that even though Samson was the victim of a love betrayed by Delilah, just as he himself had betrayed his own love for the Lord, who had so richly blessed him all of his life, in the end, Samson discovered that God's love for you and me is never fickle, no matter what. I wonder, in fact, if as he turned that grindstone, he turned over in his mind as well all that he had done wrong, and he asked God to give him one last chance to make it right. When Samson returned to the Lord who had strengthened him, God returned to him as well. He gave him back his power for one last battle. A battle which cost Samson his life here on earth, but which struck the mightiest blow for God and his people against the Philistines, which Samson had ever been able to actually do. Which brings me to make one simple observation this morning. If you've ever been let down by someone else in your life, if you've ever experienced the hurt of another person disappointing you and turning against you, if you've ever known a love betrayed and wondered if you would ever be able to trust anyone else again, let me hasten to tell you today, God will never betray you or let you down. His love truly is from everlasting to everlasting, which means he'll be there whenever you need him. He'll be there. Whenever you feel alone and lost, he'll be there. When you start to think you will never be able to find someone whom you can trust in your life, he'll be there. Only you and I have to be willing to come to God and put our faith in him, don't we? See the unfortunate reality? Nobody gets through this life without feeling betrayed or dumped sooner or later. Most of us never get through life without betraying others. Sometimes you're the dumper, and sometimes you're the dumpy. More significantly, sometimes we may even betray God. But when that happens, may we turn back once more to him whose faithfulness to us never wavers. For the great word of Judges 16 is that even after Samson had failed, been captured and blinded, and put to work doing that which an animal usually did, pushing a grindstone around a wheel, verse 22 adds that the hair on his head began to grow again. Now, his power wasn't really in his hair. It was in what his hair symbolized, his dedication to God. I can't tell you what was in Samson's heart after he was captured. I don't know his thoughts. This much I do know. No matter where we've been or what we've done, whether we have grayed hair or it's all been chopped off because of our sin or somebody else's, or maybe because of treatment for an unwanted cancer, or just from growing older in life, the story between God and us isn't over until it's over. Sometimes all it takes is a hair's breadth to make a difference. We use that expression allegorically now, of course, but centuries ago it was an actual unit of measurement that equaled 1/48 of an inch. 1/48 of an inch. Not much. But with God, it's enough. Throughout this month, we've been looking at those biblical heroes like Caleb and Joshua and Deborah and now Samson and Gideon. All of them lived in and through hard times. And some of them, like Samson, were certainly flawed individuals, maybe even like you and me. Now, we're not fighting Philistines or Midianites or Canaanites. But we got some ites of our own, don't we? Itty-bitty ites. So small we can't even see them. Powerful enough to take us down. COVIDites. COVIDites. We're not exactly oppressed. A large number of folks in the world this morning certainly are depressed. But as Winston Churchill once advised folks, if you're going through hell, keep going. When everything seems to be against you, remember, as Henry Ford did, that the airplane takes off against the wind, not with it. So even if we can't change the direction of the wind or the circumstances of our life right now, even if we can't alter what's happened in our culture, what's happened in our society, what's happened in our world, we can change how we deal with it. St. Augustine, the great father of the early church who set the agenda for the church for 1,000 years, once wrote that bad times, hard times, this is what people keep saying, but let us live well and times shall be good. We are the times. Such as we are, such are the times. After lunch today, finish reading the story of Samson in the rest of chapter 16. You will see how God answered that final prayer of that last judge of Israel. Like all those who we remember on this Memorial Day. Like those whom Takesha and DeAndre sang about at the beginning of this service, Samson ended up paying the final sacrifice. But I want to tell you, whatever your prayer this morning, God can answer it as well. You can be a hero today, hard times or not. Imperfect and flawed as you may be. Maybe even the hair on your head can begin to grow again. Amen.